This week on The Right Side, we begin 2018 with a supposedly salty Spruce Grove gas station. Victoria Mayor Lisa Helps plan to combat climate change with bike lanes, and Trudeau's questionable meeting with Joshua Boyle. We end with unemployment drops and minimum wage increases. This is The Right Side, episode 50, recorded January 6th, 2018. The Help. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to The Right Side. It's now 2018. Patrick and myself are here, resuming what we started in 2017 and carrying on throughout 2018. Welcome back.
Yeah, we're on to episode 50, and this is almost a full year of the show now, and it's been quite the journey, so I'm glad you're all with us again in 2018, and of course, here to talk more about all the stuff going on in Canada.
It certainly has been a year, and, it's almost like we never took a break for the Christmas season because, the stories we were talking about and the general theme of the stories we were talking about before the break have effectively continued throughout the Christmas break and into January, and that's what we're going to get up to in just a moment. But, if you're just joining us for the first time in this new year, if you're just joining us for the first time ever, we are a podcast that we want to cut through the bias and sensationalism in the mainstream media and present what's actually going on in the stories that you see on the daily news, whether it be Global, CBC, CTV, National Post, Globe and Mail, The Rebel. We practically go everywhere and talk about what everyone is talking about. We don't limit ourselves to one source because that would just be very bad. So
Exactly. And sometimes we even go outside of Canada to see what's going on in Canada, because sometimes the most reliable journalism isn't even the Canadian media itself. It can be found in the BBC, could be found in the American media. You never know where you're going to find a good Canadian story to talk about.
Yeah, just look back at our year in review episode, last episode, where we talked about so many things. If you want to find that, that's at rightsidenews.ca. You can also find full show notes at rightsidenews.ca if you want to follow along with what we're talking about here, so we're not making this stuff up on the go. So we're going to start with Alberta this week, and it makes sense to do that because on January 1st, our carbon tax here in Alberta went up by the 50% that the NDP promised, from $20 a ton to $30 a ton. And just as a bit of a reminder here, this translates to about 2.5 cents extra per liter of gasoline and about 50 cents more per gigajoule on natural gas that we are using to heat our houses in this cold snap that we just emerged from here. Now, as we've discussed before many times on the show, this affects all Albertans, even if you don't use a car or for some reason your house isn't heated with natural gas, because the carbon tax is rolled into everything that you purchase now. Practically anything that arrives at a store by truck or by rail, someone is paying the carbon tax along the way, and there's a good chance that some of that will be passed on to you by ways of the economic laws of taxation, but that's a topic for another show. So, along with this increase to the carbon tax, the reaction has almost been universal from everyday Albertans. But the government, on one hand, says that the newly raised carbon tax will help the provincial economy, and this was in a statement given by the Environment Minister to the Canadian press, and it was talked about thoroughly on pretty much every news media website you can find, from CTV, CBC, all the way to the Huffington Post. Actually parroted this line and talked about what was going on in there. And, with this, ultimately, they're linking between improving the economy and the carbon tax is tangential at best, because what they are effectively saying with this is that the carbon tax helped gain approval for the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion, which is going to BC, which could still face hurdles based on the BC government and the municipalities along the way. Though you might also recall from our year in review episode that in 2017, both the Northern Gateway pipeline and the Energy East pipeline met their unfortunate demise by way of overregulation, and in one case with Gateway being canceled in particular by the federal government. So even though the government here in Alberta is saying that the carbon tax will help the economy by way of securing pipelines. Well, that is 1 out of 3 pipelines that has been greenlit to continue, but still could face delays along the route. So that linking is tangential at best. Now,
And I guess to the Alberta government, 33% is a pass, right?
if we could only wish 33% was a pass in some cases.
Oh my goodness.
So the reaction to the increase in the carbon tax was swift by regular Albertans, so much so that a Tempo gas station in Spruce Grove put up a sign on their electronic billboard saying, "Thanks, NDP." And this billboard, when initially put up, read, "Thanks, NDP, F***K, NDP/Trudeau." It was later changed to "NDP carbon tax hurts all" after they received word from their parent company that they shouldn't put expletives up on their electronic billboard. The initial sign was called a profane anti-NDP sign, and, granted, yes, the words used there were profanity, but, following the placement of the sign, the gas station actually saw a surge of support, with some customers driving as far as 2 hours to fill up there just to support that gas station. So that kind of says, I think, what the general sentiment in that area is about the carbon tax in Alberta. It's not that as though everyone in Edmonton accepts it, therefore everyone outside of Edmonton will also accept it. Now, you might be wondering why we're talking about this. Well, this was actually a story because numerous media outlets reported on this. All of the local residents that were talked to in the reporting that Global Edmonton did were talked to on camera, and in general were in support of the modified sign, if not the original sign. And, they went really far to say that, this is how we feel, this is why we like Spruce Grove as a community, and this is why we like Alberta. It's because people will stand up and say this. And that's what the people who were interviewed by Global Edmonton said with this. Now, Global's report that aired on the TV and was subsequently published online also cites 2 tweets condemning the sign as an absurdity, as one said, and in another goes a step further and cites a tweet that calls the sign juvenile and weak. Now, it should be noted that anyone who wanted to actually view the tweets that Global highlighted would have a good level of difficulty in doing this. Why is this, you might ask? Well, Global didn't actually embed the tweets into the story that they were talking about on their website. Instead, what they did, it was in their video report. They put up billboards on the screen of the tweets, and they managed to typo the Twitter accounts for the Twitter usernames of both users in question. So if you went to the Twitter @handles that were mentioned on the Global News report, you would see, this user exists in one case but hasn't tweeted since 2012. And in the other case, this user doesn't exist. So it would make it seem as though, that Global was making these tweets up. And if you did want to find where these tweets actually were, you had to do a bit of Googling with the person's name in question and the actual content of the tweets. So it's not really a good way, I think, to prove an alternate viewpoint, to prove any viewpoint actually in that case, if you're going to be presenting the evidence and you're not going to make that evidence available, even though you say this was written by a specific Twitter username. Someone goes there, they see nothing. What does that say? That, I think, kind of shows that people might be making things up. But luckily for you guys here at The Right Side, we do our due diligence and we check out these sources, even if they appear to not work on first shot.
That's right. I think when you're looking at an alternate viewpoint as something, you're trying to prove that right. If you're going to Twitter, which, obviously if that's your first move, then you've already lost the argument. But if you're going to Twitter, if you're going to Twitter, I think the only reason why you should be doing that is if there is something that's trending there, or if it's getting a huge amount of support or likes or retweets about it. And if it's just random people, then that's not really good journalism, is it?
Yeah. And, this also was repeated in further media outlets such as the Edmonton Journal that also took to Twitter to find support against the sign, once again citing various tweets. Now, Twitter might be a driving force in modern conversation, but I think the weight of an on-camera interview or a recording will still carry massive weight over that of a tweet, which is, as we know right now, only 280 characters at maximum. And the fact that the media had to go to Twitter to find those willing to speak out who don't support the sign, I think that says volumes about the sign itself and the reporting that was going on here. The fact that, no one spoke on camera or spoke on audio or provided direct quotes to these people, aside from Twitter users who might not even live in the province of Alberta or Spruce Grove in this case. So it's a little bit absurd with this. And on one final note regarding this, it gets even a little bit more absurd because the Edmonton Journal piece was published internally under a different headline. And the headline, as published today, reads, Spruce Grove gas station takes down profane anti-NDP sign, replaces it with anti-carbon tax message. Though initially it was published internally as, ready for this? Salty Spruce Grove Tempo gas station takes aim at Notley/Trudeau. Now, anyone who has been around on the internet for a while, or, in general, just popular culture, will see that the term salty has often been used to define people who are overly angry at something or someone for a reason that may not be all it's made out to be. And at the end of the day, this is a perfect summation for this story in the Edmonton Journal that feels the need to throw the word salty around, which, when you think about it, isn't a professional word to use in a professional newspaper that is, syndicated nationally here in Canada. And all these references that were made to those who didn't support the sign were only shown in actual tweets and not interviews. So this says volumes when the fact that, one side of the story being presented in the Journal is focused entirely on tweets. And on the other side, you have an internal headline that uses the word salty. I think it's quite clear the way that the Edmonton Journal wanted this story to go. Probably same reason they didn't use any of the video that Global went out there to receive.
I think it's very clear in this case who the salty people actually are, right?
Yeah, those at the Edmonton Journal.
Mm-hmm.
In this case. So, and it's really unfortunate, the world we live in, that much of the media is owned by large companies, because the same people who own Edmonton Journal are the same people, once you go higher up, who own Global. And, I don't think we're at the point anymore where we get where there's criticism of the various media outlets from other media outlets. I don't think that happens enough today. And this story is a perfect example of this.
Unless, of course, they're independent media outlets, in which case they all gang up on them, right?
That's right. All right, so that's our carbon tax. Our carbon tax has gone up here in Alberta. What do you got for us in BC?
So in BC, it's been a very, very quiet week. The only real news story that came out of the legislature here was that John Horgan said that the BC government would be working hard in 2018, which could mean any number of things, of course, and we don't really know what it is because the only article was only 2 paragraphs long, which, that doesn't really give you much information. So instead, I'm going to go super local and talk about municipal governments here, and specifically in Victoria, just down the road a little ways, shall we say. In Victoria, Mayor Lisa Helps will be running for re-election, and that will be occurring in late October 2018. And she made the announcement back on January 1st. She said that though there have been successes over the past year, there is, quote, still work to do to bring more sustainability and affordability of the city. So for those who don't know, Lisa Helps ran a grassroots campaign encouraging people to vote for her to replace Mayor Dean Fortin back in 2014. And she was previously a one-term Victoria councillor. And at the time, she described herself as being neither left-wing nor right-wing. And she kind of endeared herself to younger voters who were kind of wanting a bit more of a change in direction at City Hall. And that campaign worked, as Helps actually won over Fortin by just about 89 votes. And that election was as much about the Johnson Street Bridge project as it was anything else. Now, the Johnson Street Bridge project was a project to replace I believe it was 89-year-old bridge that was crossing over crossing from Victoria over into Vic West. So it was basically a major route for the different municipalities to get into the downtown core. A very populous route, and was definitely needing replacement. But it was taking a lot of extra time, and it went over budget, as do a lot of these projects do. And it's still being completed today, actually. Many, many years later, almost a decade from when it was first started. So Fortin's opponents, of course, hammered away at the project's rising costs and the missed deadlines as failures of his leadership, and it ultimately costed him the election. And the voters wanted a change, of course. So 4 years later, it appears that the voters have gotten that change, though if that change is good is certainly debatable. Helps has attempted to make the city more environmentally friendly, and has done so by raising taxes to pay for projects such as cutting out car lanes to create two-way bike lanes in the ever-crowded downtown core. Now, ever since the first leg of that bicycling network opened, which is, of course, a 1.2-kilometer stretch on Pandora Street, which is a one-way street, and they made a two-way bike lane stretch between Cook and Wharf. It stirred up a lot of controversy. Now, some on the two-way bike route on a one-way street, they find that to be counterintuitive and confusing to motorists with its separate signals and no right turns on red lights. And others are dismayed at the loss of parking and the narrowing of the roadway. And it's been creating a lot of traffic jams on that road, and there's been lots of pictures on social media where there's a ton of cars waiting at the light, and then there's a completely empty bike lane right next to it.
Oh, that sounds so familiar.
Indeed, doesn't it? And not only that, but costs, of course, are ballooning on this project as well. So the 5.4-kilometer downtown network has actually grown to an estimated 14.5 million, which is almost 2.7 million per kilometer, and about double the 7.75 million that the city initially set aside. And the results of the bike lanes project have been polarizing. Political experts think that the issue might actually proved to be against helps in the next election in October. Says Michael Prince, UVic professor of political science, he says, quote, "This could be a real knock against her because it's something physical, concrete that people can talk about." And that's basically true, because whenever someone says the name Lisa Helps around here, people will say, "Oh, how about those bike lanes, eh?" It's basically basically a real talking point.
The question that will be asked is, did Lisa Helps help the bike lanes? And if she helped the bike lanes and people feel that they're helped by Lisa, then they'll vote for her. But if they're not helped by her, then they might not.
Exactly. And that was actually part of her campaign was a vote for helps, I believe, and that was a huge thing. So this is basically her crowning achievement, is these bike lanes. So if people don't feel like the bike lanes have actually helped the city of Victoria, then they might be persuaded to vote against her. Now, this is just one of the projects that Helps is attempting to complete. She says that combating climate change will have to take center stage this upcoming year and throughout the next term. Now, she said, quote, "Our job is to make sure that in 2050, Victoria is sustainable and that Victoria is affordable. Part of that is bike lanes, and part of that is affordable housing, even when people feel it is hard to have that in their neighborhood. Part of that is taking really bold action, and this is a lot of what the next term is going to be about, on climate action." Now, speaking of affordable housing, that was another major issue of Help's term as mayor. Now, despite her considering it a priority, median household prices continue to skyrocket. And though more buildings are being constructed to keep up with the demand, prices are still sky high. And homeless numbers have been increasing as well. And this actually gave rise to a tent city back on the courthouse lawn in November 2015. And it actually stayed there almost an entire year until mid-August 2016. I believe we actually covered that in one of our summer episodes on the right side. And perceived special treatment given to the residents of the tent city encampment, and what some thought was indifference to the surrounding neighborhood concerns, actually gave birth to a Mad as Hell neighborhood group. And some people from that group are actually actively campaigning against Helps and her entire council. Now, transportation is also a major issue in Victoria, which is something that Helps recognizes, but it's also been something that hasn't been really done very much of in Victoria. With the focus and the money being on bike lanes, there hasn't really been anything left over for rapid transit. Now, currently, there is no rapid transit linking downtown to the increasingly populated West Shore communities of Langford, Colwood, and Chosen, and daily congestion slows the Trans-Canada Highway to a crawl daily, and affordable light rapid transit would be expensive, but it might just be what the South Island needs as Victoria gets bigger and bigger. But currently, there's been no plan set aside for that whatsoever. And that's something that will come back to bite Helps if she ends up losing in the next election, of course. Now, Helps' announcement has also sparked early opposition in Victoria. There's been a group known as newcouncil.ca, which is actually counting the days, hours, minutes, and seconds until the election day, similar to groups that have been counting down that in Alberta. Now, members are actively searching for candidates to oppose Helps and others councillors. And of course, we'll have to keep following the story to see if any frontrunners emerge and what ideas candidates will have to fix the problems that past mayors have not addressed.
When it comes down to looking at ways to reduce costs in these cities and reduce the congestion that happens with transportation, you can't do both, at least not effectively, if the option chosen is light rail. Light rail is super expensive. We're playing with that idea right here now in Edmonton, and it's something that needs to be thought out so very well. And if there are any little bumps along the road, no pun intended with that, you can see light rail cost balloon, and there are just so many different things to consider with this. And the fact Victoria is looking at light rail, I don't know if that would be the best option for you guys, because it's a lot more condensed there than it is here in Edmonton. Therefore, perhaps the bus rapid transit route is best. But if Lisa Helps isn't going to be looking into all these options and is going to have the mounting questions about, downtown congestion on her plate come this fall, she might not actually win. And as I was saying, with a name like Lisa Helps and the fact she ran on that last time, that is something that can easily be turned around and is some branding that might not be to her advantage this time.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's something that we'll have to see, because before, when she was running, there was a lot of baggage that Dean Fortin had, and that's the reason why he was voted out. Now, Helps herself has quite a bit of baggage, what with the tent city and the bike lane project and all the other stuff that's been going on as well. So we're going to have to see how that works, because she's kind of perceived herself as someone who's not either left wing or right wing, as I mentioned before, but it's very clear she's very much an environmentalist.
Yeah.
And she's been a community activist in the past, and she's been working with a lot of different associations to try and push certain projects through. And I think that was what helped her get elected as mayor. So if those groups are still supporting her, there may be a bit of a fight, but it really comes down to who comes out to vote on election day, as it always does. And with it being in October, we'll have to see who shows up to run against her, and to see if there's anyone else out there that has any ideas on how to fix Victoria's problems.
All right, sounds good. That might be a little surprise that comes in October. We'll just have to wait and see.
Exactly.
All right, so moving to Canada, we do also have some surprises on this front this week. And, as I mentioned in our show open, 2017, the trends of 2017 seem content thus far to continue into 2018. And if there's one thing that 2017 taught us, it's that the Trudeau government isn't exactly afraid of normalizing Omar Khadr or people like Omar Khadr. Now, you might be wondering, where does Omar Khadr come into this, and why are we talking about Omar Khadr again? Well, the simple answer to that is Joshua Boyle. Joshua Boyle was once actually married to the sister of Omar Khadr, who has links to terrorism in Pakistan. And even the CTV has called Khadr's sister jihad supporting. So a week before Christmas, on December 18th, 2017, the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, had a secret meeting with Joshua Boyle and his family. So now you might be asking, why was it secret? Well, it was secret because it wasn't listed on the Prime Minister's official schedule. And when events are left out of the Prime Minister's schedule, especially of this magnitude, something isn't right. Because the Prime Minister's schedule is what the people around Ottawa, and the media in particular, look to see what's happening with the Prime Minister on that day and what he's doing, if it's going to be of any consequence, if it's anything that they might need to cover. Well, this was left out, and I think as we get through the story, you're going to see why it was left out. So you might be wondering, who is Joshua Boyle then? Well, he's a father and a husband who took his family to Afghanistan as missionaries. Following this, they were captured by ISIL-linked hostage takers, and this whole ordeal lasted 5 years and ended this past October. Now, once the family was freed, it was immediately clear that something wasn't right. Boyle wouldn't take a flight back to Canada by way of the U.S. because he was under the fear that the U.S. would hold him under some unknown criminal charges. So he didn't want to enter the U.S. He wanted to come back straight to Canada. Now, this week on January 2nd, it was revealed that he was facing 15 serious criminal charges. These are apparently unlinked with his past behavior before returning to Canada and are said to have taken place between October 14th and December 30th, 2017. The charges are 8 counts of assault, 2 counts of sexual assault, 2 counts of unlawful confinement, and 1 count of misleading police to, quote, divert suspicion from himself. Now, the question now goes back to the Prime Minister. And this is being asked in print, but not so much on the television media. And the question is, why did the Prime Minister meet with such a person? And who exactly should be able to meet with the Prime Minister? Because if you think someone who has 15 criminal convictions against him, or in this case, criminal charges, not convictions yet, why is that person meeting with the Prime Minister? Now, this was asked by CTV's Don Martin. He said, the meeting never officially happened. That could signal political discomfort with a man who showed telltale early signs of being odd and bordering on bizarre. The
Are they talking about Boyle there, or are they talking about Trudeau?
Yeah, because the meeting is definitely very bizarre in this case. So
Exactly.
Very, very good distinction there to be made. But I think in the quote of this, the man they were talking about was indeed Boyle. The CTV piece also then highlights that the photos that Trudeau and Boyle were a part of can lead to many different conclusions because ultimately a picture is worth 1,000 words, as they say. And in this case, many of them are questions of bad judgment. This was, of course, still said by the CTV. These sentiments were also echoed by both CBC and Global, in that there were more questions coming out of this than could possibly be answered by such a meeting. And a former CSIS agent named Phil Gursky said that going into the meeting with Trudeau, there were enough unanswered questions to have given pause to the staff of the Prime Minister's office, including Boyle's decision to take his pregnant wife backpacking to Afghanistan in the first place. And this hits the nail right on the head. CSIS, of course, is the intelligence service for Canada and is funded by the Canadian government. And if, CSIS is asking about this, CSIS would want to know specifically what was happening in a meeting like this, because, you don't just have someone who goes to Afghanistan and then has 15 criminal charges on him meeting with the Prime Minister. Something is not adding up here. And, it just keeps getting amplified because given the recent rulings of the Ethics Commissioner regarding to Trudeau's past Christmas vacation in 2016, we ultimately need to ask ourselves why the decision was made to have this meeting. Because at the end of the day, it just speaks of poor judgment. And if CSIS is very concerned about this, the question needs to be, why wasn't the Prime Minister concerned about this? And what was the Prime Minister doing? And what was the Prime Minister's office's intent of having this meeting? Because if you think about a perfect world, in a perfect world, would the security services for a country, in this case CSIS, authorize our leader to meet with someone who potentially has this many criminal charges on him and could perhaps even bring harm to the Prime Minister? I don't think they would authorize such a meeting. So these are questions that are going to need to be kept prodded on for the Prime Minister and ensure that there was nothing fishy going on between Boyle's family and the federal government in this meeting.
And it also makes you wonder what they were talking about and what exactly the Prime Minister hoped to gain to get out of this meeting, because politicians, they don't normally do things without gain. After all, there's usually a reason for doing things, and in this case, you have to wonder what it is that Trudeau thought would be a good thing about this meeting. And I think the only conclusion that we can actually link it to is that he's basically the husband of the sister of Omar Khadr, who, of course, Trudeau gave the settlement to back in the summertime. And it's just interesting how many links there are there and how we have to piece it all together from missing information.
Yeah, it feels like we're being detectives here.
Exactly, and that's not something we're supposed to be doing as just regular citizens here. I mean, this is what the news is supposed to be for, is to ferret out this information, but we're having to do the same thing. It almost makes us feel like we're the journalists here, right?
Yeah, and I mean, it is just truly bizarre given the fact that money was given to Omar Khadr, and this guy was married to Omar Khadr's sister. Mm-hmm. It doesn't add up, and there needs to be some way for people to peer into what the content of this meeting was, aside from just waiting for its contents to be divulged by the Prime Minister's office, which is unlikely to happen, I think. So,
yeah, that's true, and especially with all the bad press about it, we're definitely not going to hear about it now. They're going to try and probably cover it up as much as they can, right?
Indeed.
Just as they did with Carter.
That's right. On a Friday afternoon.
Exactly.
So that leads us into our first firing line of 2018, and it's some stats that look good on the surface, but perhaps aren't. So what do you got?
That's right. So the headline here was that Canada's unemployment rate falls to lowest rate in over 40 years. And this is from Statistics Canada, who said that the unemployment rate dropped to 5.7% back in December, and this was down from 5.9% the month before. And this is reaching its lowest mark since comparable data became available back in 1976. And the Statistics Canada survey found that the biggest gains over the last year were seen in retail and wholesale trade, which boasted 26,500 jobs in December, up from 24,000 the year previous. And the finance, insurance, and real estate sector added 2,300 new positions, and the accommodation and food service sector added 3,500 positions. Now, those gains were offset by a decline in the business, building, and support services sector, which shedded about 4,600 positions, and information, culture, and recreation sector, which lost 2,000 positions. Now, this is being touted as a good thing, this low unemployment rate. But I think what's being missed here in the media is that only 1/3 of these new jobs created are full-time. Out of the 78,600 net new positions, only 23,700 are full-time jobs. And with so many new jobs being created being part-time, that gives a lot more leverage to the companies in how they can hire and how they can structure their employment packages with when it comes to their new employees. And with minimum wage hikes in Ontario on January 1st from $11.60 up to $14, and with Quebec, PEI, and Alberta's minimum wage hikes going to be happening later in the year, and with the BC NDP saying that they're going to do that in the future as well, it could lead to a lot of part-time workers' hours being cut or paid breaks or benefits slashed with little recourse with all of this that's been going on.
Yeah, and this leads to the core of the story, is that only 1/3 of them are full-time, and we need to just take for a moment and compare the differences between a full-time and a part-time position. The full-time positions generally pay more, they have better benefits, and they are generally longer-term propositions compared to just part-time. And that's something that is sorely missed from this story, I feel, because it's good to create jobs, but at the same time, if they're part-time jobs, it's not necessarily creating careers that are going to sustain a family or sustain an individual throughout their life. And also, along with this, you need to remember that every time the minimum wage goes up, that can also drive inflation. Now, if all these provinces, Ontario, of course, being the largest, are increasing their minimum wage, it's not entirely unforeseeable that the inflation rate in Ontario could tick up a little knot. And of course, what this means is that things in general in Ontario will become more expensive, and it could very well be, though not guaranteed, that the minimum wage increase that was just brought in isn't going to be nearly as potent as it was going to thought to be. So that's something that a lot of people need to be wary of here is that A, these are part-time positions, and B, raising minimum wage by this amount in this many jurisdictions could potentially cause issues with the inflation rate, which is ultimately removing the whole reason why we're looking at raising the minimum wage here.
Yeah, that's right. And with the inflation going up, they're saying that the extra $2.40 that the minimum wage in Ontario is going up will net workers about an extra $95 a week. So that would be just about 350 or so dollars per month. Now, if you offset that with all the cost increased in cost of, say, groceries or gas or rent, prices are going to go up due to inflation because of this, and a lot of that money is probably going to be lost due to those unexpected costs. So, with the minimum wage increasing, the people that are making minimum will not really be seeing that much extra benefit out of it.
That hits the nail
And
on the head entirely.
yeah,
And another thing with this is that you can look at Ontario, you can look at Alberta, you can look at PEI, you can look at Washington State, you can look at San Francisco, you can look at pretty much any other city you decide to choose. And it seems as though the generally accepted minimum wage marker to hit in all of these places is $15 an hour. And that came out of a study in Washington State. But the question needs to be, is $15 an hour okay in Edmonton? Is it okay in Victoria? Is it all right in Toronto or Montreal, for example? And the reason that I'm asking this question right now is because $15 an hour buys you a different amount of stuff that in Edmonton than it does in Victoria or Seattle.
that's right. I mean, different provincial sales tax rates. For instance, in Alberta, there is none. In BC, it's 7%. So that makes quite a bit of a difference as to what that extra $95 per week can actually buy you.
Yeah.
It certainly does not go nearly as far in Victoria and Vancouver as it would in, say, Fort St. John or Prince George or a lot of other more northern cities where things might cost more, but generally housing is not nearly as much. And that's basically the same case where it will be in Ontario, where a lot of the costs in Toronto, which is where most of the population is based, is going to be affected by this. But in other cities, such as, let's say, Timmins or Thunder Bay, the costs there and the wages and what they're going to be able to buy are going to be much different. So making it for the entire province is basically it's not going to affect all areas the same, and it's going to affect the small businesses and the workers in the smaller cities quite a bit more disproportionately than it will in the bigger cities.
Spot on.
All right, so now what we're going with there is we could also talk about Alberta, and now Alberta's unemployment rate also contributes to this reduced figure on the national employment rate. Now, we've talked about previously, Shane's definitely talked about that, about the Alberta unemployment rate and how it can go down, but it's ultimately an issue of labor force participation, especially in Edmonton and Calgary. And the unemployment rate in those two cities is still at 7.5%, and that's only lower than St. John's and Saskatoon. And a lot of those are part-time positions, and with the part-time positions being filled nationally, the employment recovery in Alberta has been with the service industry, primarily with the national resources and energy sector to follow. And the market has not fully recovered to pre-recession levels since during the phase from 2015 through today, Alberta's population has also increased. And I think where we're seeing a lot of the unemployment in the bigger cities, it's because the rebound has been happening in certain industries, but it's not been happening in the natural resource sector. Primarily due to the market, primarily due to the economy, and also partly to do with the government and the government's priorities in Alberta. I think that's fair to say, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And I think also troubling is that in BC, where unemployment, especially in Vancouver and Victoria, is actually among the lowest in Canada, businesses are finding it harder than ever to find workers. Now, Frank Burry, who is the principal of chemistry consulting in Victoria, he said that inaction is not an option as businesses scramble to attract workers. He said, quote, "This can only be solved through immigration, workforce housing, and better transportation and daycare, or it's only going to get worse because I don't see the economy going south anytime soon." And BC is also not really getting that many migrant workers from within Canada, probably due to the high housing costs and the lack of childcare and transportation infrastructure. And of course, we're just talking about the transportation infrastructure in Victoria, and quite simply, it's really too expensive to live in a city without that full-time job, but to be able to sustain you. And the tech sector has actually seen the biggest demand, especially in BC, as it's one of the fastest growing industries in Canada. Said Dan Gunn, who is the chief executive of the Victoria Innovation, Advanced Technology and Entrepreneurship Council, he said, quote, "I would say the lack of skilled workers isn't just a 2017 or 2018 problem, but it's been an ongoing challenge for the growing tech companies in Victoria. To find skilled and experienced talent has been difficult, and it's probably the biggest thing holding back growth." Now, he said that while the city and the tech sector in particular has never focused as much attention on the problem as now, it still has to compete with a strong national economy that demands workers. Now, locally, the tech sector has been seeing steady demand for workers. The ViaTech Job Board, which regulates a lot of the jobs in the tech industry, has posted more than 1,100 jobs over the last year, and it's consistently had about 100 job openings on its board each month. Uh, so this is something that's going to have to be rectified as we go into 2018, is to see where all these skilled workers can be found. And if there's none to be found, where are we going to get them and how can we train them up through the education system? Because I think that's one thing that one place where you can actually find a lot of new workers in a long-term situation is being able to train them basically in-house in your own province through your own population. And I think that's probably the best way to do it, because that will create a lot better results in the future, because someone who's born here is more likely to stay here.
Yeah, that's entirely right. And this is the problem of these forward-looking governments that you see in Alberta's NDP, and in particular the federal Trudeau government. Is they, when they came in, they had a high emphasis on focusing on the technology fields and whatnot, but there really hasn't been anything trickling down into those industries, specifically on the education side of things, that we've seen yet. And here in Alberta and federally in Canada, we should be seeing something by now, as those two governments are past their midterm point. So it's something we're going to have to watch out for in BC with the new NDP government there as it ages.
Hmm. Now, there's been a lot of talk and controversy about the minimum wage increase in Ontario, especially. Um, and there's been a lot of talk that a lot of businesses will be cutting pay, they'll be cutting benefits, and a lot of other employee perks that you get from working at a company. And a lot of companies have been talking about that. And the biggest profile one in the news over the past week has been Tim Hortons. And there's been a case there where Kathleen Wynne, who's the Premier of Ontario, has been accusing franchisees of Tim Hortons who run and operate their own restaurants under the Tim Hortons brand, that they will be canceling out a lot of the benefits that a lot of employees will be getting from working there due to the minimum wage hike, and that they're basically greedy for doing so. And the company has actually come out against them and said that they are not going to be doing that, and that they are encouraging all of their franchisees to keep all those benefits in place, and that there is a way to work around that. But for Tim Hortons is a very large company, and there's a lot of smaller companies that will be feeling the pinch of the minimum wage increase. And it'll probably get offset by either rising costs to the consumer, or they're going to find it in different ways. I remember a story we did back a couple months ago where we had a survey on where a lot of companies said they would just offset the costs onto either the consumer or onto their employees, and that they would not be making or basically eating the cost of the minimum wage increase if it happened. And now we're seeing this basically in place here.
All right. Well, that sounds good. We'll definitely have to watch that because, there's no way of guaranteeing whether or not the subsidies in question here regarding the minimum wage hike for businesses like Tim Hortons will come back and be hoisted onto the employees or whatnot. That could just be a maneuvering ploy that Kathleen Wynne is trying since she is going to an election this June. So we'll just have to watch and wait and see on that. But
yeah, we can always predict trends, but we can't actually see into the future ourselves, unfortunately. So we'll have to see what happens with all this and see how it actually impacts the economy of Ontario and therefore Canada as a whole, and what that will bode for the future for other provinces that are planning on raising their own minimum wage.
All right, sounds good. Well, with that being said, we're on to our first word of the week now for 2018. And our word of the week this week is salty. Now, if you look in the definition, you'll find the word salty means tasting of, containing, or preserved with salt, or specifically when speaking of language or humor, down to earth or coarse. And it can also mean tough or aggressive, or as was the case with the Edmonton Journal headline, as outlined here by Urban Dictionary, somebody who contains large amounts of sodium chloride, thus causing them to be upset, which, of course, we talked about here. It was probably the case of the Edmonton Journal. So we thought we would use salty as the word of the week for the first in 2018.
Good word to start us off for the year, for sure.
Yeah, and we're not salty here at the right side. We just present the facts and let the facts speak for themselves. So
exactly.
If you guys want full show notes, you can find that at rightsidenews.ca. We're also on iTunes and YouTube at rightsidenews.ca/iTunes and rightsidenews.ca/YouTube. And we're also on social media at Twitter and Facebook at RightSideCA, where you can follow us and we post our news stories throughout the week, things that don't make it onto the actual show. Lots of interesting stories there. But until then, we'll see you next week for another episode of The Right Side.
And we will continue to cut through all the bias and sensationalism that you see in the media, and we'll always give you the straight, hard facts of the news. And with that, we will see you next week for another episode of The Right Side.